If you understand cycles, you understand that they don't operate in isolation. Te interact, amplifiada, occasionally converge, create moments that reshape entire civilizations. We're approaching one of those moments in 2026. This isn't speculation. This isn't fear-mongering. This is the mathematical result of multiple cycles that have been building pressure for decades, all reaching critical points simultaneously. I've spent years studying economic history, watching patterns repeat with clockwork precision. What I'm seeing now is something I've only read about in history books. 3 massive cycles are converging: the long-term debt cycle that governs monetary systems, the demographic cycle that drives fiscal policy, and the geopolitical cycle that determines reserve currency status. When these cycles align, they don't just create recessions or bear markets. They create new eras. The last time we saw convergence of this magnitude was in the 1940s. Before that, the 1870s. Before that, the early 1800s. Each time, wealth was massively redistributed from those who didn't see it coming to those who positioned themselves correctly. The question isn't whether this will happen. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does. Let me start with the debt cycle, because everything else flows from this fundamental force. Ray Dalio has extensively documented how debt cycles work over 75 to 100-year periods. We read currently in what he calls the late stage of the long-term debt cycle that began after World War II. This is the phase where debt grows faster than the economy's ability to service it, forcing increasingly desperate monetary policies. The numbers are staggering and undeniable. American national debt has surpassed $33 trillion. To put this in perspective, this represents more than 120% of GDP. The United States now owes more money than it produces in an entire year. Even more concerning, the interest payments on this debt now consume over $1 trillion annually. That's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than Social Security, just the interest. This creates what economists call a debt trap. When you're borrowing money just to pay the interest on money you've already borrowed, you're no longer investing in productive capacity. You're just postponing the inevitable reckoning. And the mathematics of compound interest ensure that this reckoning becomes more severe the longer it's delayed. But here's where the debt cycle becomes truly dangerous. As interest rates rise, which they must to combat inflation, the cost of servicing this debt explodes exponentially. A 1 percentage point increase in average interest rates adds over $300 billion to annual debt service. A 3 percentage point increase, which is historically modest, would add nearly $1 trillion to the federal budget. There simply isn't enough tax revenue to cover this without destroying the economy. This forces governments into what I call the monetary policy death spiral. They must choose between fiscal responsibility, which would trigger immediate economic collapse, or monetary inflation, which gradually destroys the currency's purchasing power. History shows us that governments always choose inflation because it is politically easier to steal wealth slowly and invisibly than to cut spending dramatically and visibly. Now layer in the demographic cycle, which is creating unprecedented fiscal pressures that make the debt situation exponentially worse. Every day, more than 10,000 Americans turn 65 and become eligible for Medicare and Social Security. This isn't a temporary phenomenon. It will continue for the next 15 years as the baby boom generation fully retires. The mathematical reality is brutal. Social Security and Medicare are pay-as-you-go systems. Current workers fund current retirees, but the ratio of workers to retirees is collapsing. In 1960, there were over 5 workers supporting each retiree. Today, there are fewer than 3. By 2035, there will be fewer than 2.5. This demographic math doesn't care about political promises or accounting tricks. It's simply impossible to maintain current benefit levels with this worker-to-retiree ratio. The Congressional Budget Office projects that mandatory spending on Social Security, Medicare, and debt interest will consume 100% of federal tax revenue by 2033, not 90%, 100%. This means that everything else the government does, defense, infrastructure, education, all discretionary spending would require additional borrowing. This is mathematically unsustainable. But the demographic cycle creates another pressure that most people don't consider. Older populations are naturally more risk-averse and politically powerful. They vote to protect their benefits regardless of the long-term fiscal consequences. This creates a political dynamic where fiscal responsibility becomes essentially impossible. No politician can win elections by promising to cut Social Security or Medicare, even if maintaining them requires destroying the currency. The third cycle, the geopolitical cycle, is perhaps the most dangerous because it threatens the fundamental advantage that has allowed the United States to run these massive deficits for decades. Since 1971, when the dollar became the world's reserve currency, America has enjoyed what French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the currency that everyone else needs has allowed the United States to export its inflation and import real goods and services. But this privilege isn't permanent. It's a function of economic and military dominance, and both are being challenged simultaneously. China's economy is now approaching parity with the United States in purchasing power terms. Russia, despite sanctions, continues to supply essential commodities to much of the world. Most importantly, these countries are actively working to create alternative payment systems that bypass the dollar-dominated financial system. The signs of dollar hegemony erosion are becoming impossible to ignore. Central banks globally are reducing their dollar reserves and increasing their gold holdings at rates not seen since the 1970s. China and Russia have dramatically increased bilateral trade in their own currencies. The BRICS nations are developing alternative payment mechanisms. Even European allies are creating systems to reduce dependence on dollar-based transactions. This geopolitical cycle follows a predictable pattern throughout history. Rising powers challenge established powers. The established power initially maintains dominance through economic strength. But as relative economic power declines, it increasingly relies on military force and financial coercion. This creates resentment and accelerates the search for alternatives. Eventually, a crisis provides the catalyst for a new system to emerge. We're clearly in the late stages of this cycle. The increasing use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool has accelerated global efforts to create dollar alternatives. The freezing of Russian central bank assets demonstrated to every nation that holding dollars is a political decision, not just an economic one. This has profound implications for future dollar demand. Now, here's why 2026 represents the convergence point. The debt cycle has reached the point where fiscal responsibility would trigger immediate crisis. But monetary irresponsibility is accelerating currency debasement. The demographic cycle is entering its most intense phase as baby boomer retirements accelerate and the worker-to-retiree ratio collapses further. The geopolitical cycle is reaching the point where alternative systems are becoming viable and dollar alternatives are being actively implemented. History teaches us that when these cycles converge, the transition happens much faster than anyone expects. The British pound dominated global finance for over a century. But its displacement as the reserve currency happened primarily in the 2 decades after World War II. The process accelerated rapidly once it became clear that Britain could no longer maintain its economic and military dominance. What makes cycle convergence so dangerous for individual wealth is that it creates massive wealth redistribution in a very short time period. Those who understand what's happening position themselves to benefit from the new reality. Those who don't understand find their wealth quietly confiscated through currency debasement, asset repricing, and system restructuring. Let me give you a concrete example from the last major convergence in the 1970s. The debt cycle had reached unsustainability, forcing Nixon to abandon the gold standard in 1971. Demographics were creating fiscal pressures. As New Deal programs matured and Vietnam War costs mounted. Geopolitically, American economic dominance was being challenged by recovering European and Japanese economies. Those who recognized the convergence and positioned themselves in real assets, stocks, real estate, commodities, precious metals saw their wealth preserved and often multiplied. Those who maintained faith in the old system, keeping money in savings accounts and government bonds, saw their purchasing power systematically destroyed. Over the decade, real assets dramatically outperformed paper assets as the monetary system restructured around a new reality. The wealth redistribution wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of maintaining confidence in a system that was fundamentally changing. Those close to the sources of new money, banks, large corporations, sophisticated investors, could position themselves before the effects became obvious. Regular savers and wage earners only felt the consequences after the redistribution was largely complete. We're seeing the early stages of the same process today. Silver's 144% rise in 2025 isn't random speculation. It's institutional capital beginning to hedge against monetary system risk. Gold's performance, central bank buying patterns, the emergence of alternative payment systems. These are all early indicators of positioning that's happening at the highest levels of the financial system. But here's the critical insight about timing. By the time cycle convergence becomes obvious to everyone, the major repositioning has already occurred. The wealthy and sophisticated move first, when assets are still reasonably priced and positioning is still possible. The general public moves last, when assets have already appreciated dramatically and it's too late to achieve meaningful protection. This is why 2026 matters so much. We're in the window where the convergence is mathematically clear to those who understand cycles, but not yet obvious to the general public. This creates a brief opportunity to position appropriately before the transition accelerates. The positioning strategies that work during cycle convergence are fundamentally different from normal investment approaches. During stable periods, you can focus on growth, yield, and traditional risk metrics. During convergence periods, the primary concern becomes system risk. You need assets that maintain value regardless of which monetary or political system emerges. This means diversifying not just across asset classes, but across systems. Holding assets in multiple currencies, especially those of countries with stronger fiscal positions. Owning real assets that have intrinsic value regardless of monetary policy. Maintaining some exposure to precious metals as insurance against complete system breakdown. Having productive assets that generate income in multiple jurisdictions. It also means understanding leverage differently. During stable periods, leverage can enhance returns. During convergence periods, leverage becomes extremely dangerous because it ties your survival to the stability of the very system that is changing. The most important factor becomes liquidity and flexibility to adapt as conditions evolve. The psychological challenge is enormous because the old system appears to be working right up until the moment it does. Stock markets can reach new highs while the underlying monetary system becomes increasingly unstable. Currency can appear strong while the fundamentals deteriorate. Government bonds can seem safe while the government's fiscal position becomes untenable. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s. In 1972, just a year after Nixon closed the gold window, the stock market hit new highs and the economy appeared healthy. By 1974, inflation was accelerating, the stock market had crashed, and the currency crisis was undeniable. The transition from apparent stability to obvious crisis happened in less than 2 years. What I find most concerning about our current situation is that the convergence appears to be accelerating. The debt cycle pressures are intensifying as interest rates rise. The demographic pressures are mounting as retirements accelerate. The geopolitical pressures are building as alternative systems become operational. Unlike the gradual changes of previous decades, multiple systems appear to be reaching critical points simultaneously. The Federal Reserve's policy dilemma perfectly illustrates the impossible position created by cycle convergence. They need to raise rates to combat inflation and maintain dollar credibility. But higher rates make the debt burden unsustainable and threaten financial system stability. They need to maintain easy policy to prevent fiscal crisis. But easy policy accelerates currency debasement and geopolitical challenges to dollar dominance. Those who recognized the convergence and positioned themselves in real assets, stocks, real estate, commodities, precious metals saw their wealth preserved and often multiplied. Those who maintained faith in the old system, keeping money in savings accounts and government bonds, saw their purchasing power systematically destroyed. Over the decade, real assets dramatically outperformed paper assets as the monetary system restructured around a new reality. The wealth redistribution wasn't accidental. It was the inevitable result of maintaining confidence in a system that was fundamentally changing. Those close to the sources of new money, banks, large corporations, sophisticated investors, could position themselves before the effects became obvious. Regular savers and wage earners only felt the consequences after the redistribution was largely complete. We're seeing the early stages of the same process today. Silver's 144% rise in 2025 isn't random speculation. It's institutional capital beginning to hedge against monetary system risk. Gold's performance, central bank buying patterns, the emergence of alternative payment systems. These are all early indicators of positioning that's happening at the highest levels of the financial system. But here's the critical insight about timing. By the time cycle convergence becomes obvious to everyone, the major repositioning has already occurred. The wealthy and sophisticated move first, when assets are still reasonably priced and positioning is still possible. The general public moves last, when assets have already appreciated dramatically and it's too late to achieve meaningful protection. This is why 2026 matters so much. We're in the window where the convergence is mathematically clear to those who understand cycles, but not yet obvious to the general public. This creates a brief opportunity to position appropriately before the transition accelerates. The positioning strategies that work during cycle convergence are fundamentally different from normal investment approaches. During stable periods, you can focus on growth, yield, and traditional risk metrics. During convergence periods, the primary concern becomes system risk. You need assets that maintain value regardless of which monetary or political system emerges. This means diversifying not just across asset classes, but across systems. Holding assets in multiple currencies, especially those of countries with stronger fiscal positions. Owning real assets that have intrinsic value regardless of monetary policy. Maintaining some exposure to precious metals as insurance against complete system breakdown. Having productive assets that generate income in multiple jurisdictions. It also means understanding leverage differently. During stable periods, leverage can enhance returns. During convergence periods, leverage becomes extremely dangerous because it ties your survival to the stability of the very system that is changing. The most important factor becomes liquidity and flexibility to adapt as conditions evolve. The psychological challenge is enormous because the old system appears to be working right up until the moment it does. Stock markets can reach new highs while the underlying monetary system becomes increasingly unstable. Currency can appear strong while the fundamentals deteriorate. Government bonds can seem safe while the government's fiscal position becomes untenable. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s. In 1972, just a year after, Nixon closed the gold window. The stock market hit new highs and the economy appeared healthy. By 1974, inflation was accelerating, the stock market had crashed, and the currency crisis was undeniable. The transition from apparent stability to obvious crisis happened in less than 2 years. What I find most concerning about our current situation is that the convergence appears to be accelerating. The debt cycle pressures are intensifying as interest rates rise. The demographic pressures are mounting as retirements accelerate. The geopolitical pressures are building as alternative systems become operational. Unlike the gradual changes of previous decades, multiple systems appear to be reaching critical points simultaneously. The Federal Reserve's policy dilemma perfectly illustrates the impossible position created by cycle convergence. They need to raise rates to combat inflation and maintain dollar credibility. But higher rates make the debt burden unsustainable and threaten financial system stability. They need to maintain easy policy to prevent fiscal crisis. But easy policy accelerates currency debasement and geopolitical challenges to dollar dominance. This is what economists call a policy trap. Every available option creates bigger problems elsewhere in the system. When policymakers reach this point, they typically choose the option that delays the crisis rather than solving it, which ultimately makes the eventual resolution more severe. The international response tells you everything you need to know about how sophisticated actors view this convergence. China's massive gold accumulation, Russia's de-dollarization efforts, European development of alternative payment systems. These aren't reactions to temporary policy disagreements. These are preparations for fundamental system change. Even domestically, the behavior of major corporations reveals an understanding of what's coming. The increase in corporate debt to finance stock buybacks and dividends the accumulation of real assets on. Corporate balance sheets the development of alternative currencies and payment systems. These actions only make sense if management believes the current monetary system is unsustainable. The challenge for individual wealth preservation is that you can't time these transitions precisely. You can see the mathematical inevitability and position appropriately, but you can't predict exactly when the old system will reach its breaking point. This requires a different approach to risk management than most people are accustomed to. Instead of trying to optimize returns, you optimize for survivability across different scenarios. Instead of betting on specific outcomes, you position for multiple possible futures. Instead of maximizing current income, you preserve long-term purchasing power. Instead of following conventional wisdom about diversification, you diversify across different monetary and political systems. The cost of this approach during stable periods is lower returns than you might achieve through more aggressive positioning. But the benefit during convergence periods is that you maintain your wealth and flexibility while others lose both. Over complete cycles, This conservative approach often produces superior, long-term results because it avoids the devastating losses that occur during major transitions. The mathematics of wealth preservation during cycle convergence are unforgiving. If you lose 50% of your wealth, you need 100% gains just to break even. If you lose 70%, you need more than 200% gains to recover. These recovery requirements become practically impossible during the chaotic conditions that typically follow merge. This is why positioning before convergence becomes obvious is so critical. Once the transition begins in earnest, asset prices become extremely volatile. Liquidity disappears at critical moments, and the political environment often becomes hostile to wealth preservation strategies. By the time everyone understands what's happening, the opportunity to protect yourself has largely passed. I believe we're in the final window before this convergence accelerates beyond the point where individual positioning can provide meaningful protection. The debt mathematics are becoming undeniable. The demographic pressures are intensifying. And the geopolitical challenges to dollar dominance are becoming operational rather than theoretical. The choice, as always, is yours. You can maintain faith in the current system and hope that somehow the mathematical impossibilities resolve themselves peacefully. Or you can recognize that cycles don't care about political promises or conventional wisdom and position yourself accordingly. History will judge our generation based on how we respond to this convergence. Those who understand what's happening and prepare appropriately will preserve and potentially increase their wealth. Those who ignore the mathematical realities and cling to outdated concepts of financial safety will discover that their definition of prudence was actually the greatest risk of all. The convergence is accelerating. The window for positioning is narrowing. The mathematics are relentless. The choice is yours, but the consequences of that choice will determine not just your financial future, but the financial future of your children and grandchildren. This isn't a prediction about what might happen. This is an analysis of what is happening based on cycles that have repeated throughout human history. The only variable is whether you'll be prepared when the convergence reaches its inevitable conclusion.